Hi, everybody. Welcome to Plural Acceptance Week, and it's Quoigenic Wednesday.
Hi, everyone. We want to take a moment to ask the whole Plural community and all of our allies and supporters who are listening to this to please take a moment to sign the ISSTD petition on behalf of plurals in distress who are seeking for therapy. Many plurals want to make sure that the treatment standards are updated and the treatment times for plurals in distress are improved. There is more information in the link in the description down below.
We will have other content on what Quoigenic is, but in this video, we wanted to address issues around system composition. Who's in our head, where they come from. It's a common point of comparison when we get plural folk into a room or a chat group. We always compare the types of alters and where they came from, and nobody really wants to feel weird, like they're completely out there. So it's great to talk about shared experiences and then end up feeling not so alone. So we talk about our head counts, which we'll talk more about on Sunday. We talk about gender, which we'll talk more about on Friday. And we also talk about where our headmates come from, which is what we're talking about today.
Nice.
So a little background, a little technical background. The structural dissociation theory is one of the leading theories out there right now, and that gives us the idea of parallel alter development from infancy onward, that any potential merging process may take place or not take place at all, or it could be interrupted by trauma. So according to structural dissociation theory, everybody is born plural. You have many different tracks in your brain. Many multiples, whether plural identified or not, find this theory reassuring because many of us don't have a clear host or original, and many of us feel like equals within our system. So no one has a birthright to our shared life. And this is really important to some of us, especially when we're pressured by singular folk to talk about who the real birth person is or who we're all going to merge into when we get fixed by the therapist. But many of us feel that we've been this way as long as we can remember, and there's no looking back.
Right? It's kind of like when you have like a gay relationship and they ask who the guy is in the lesbian relationship,
who's the
right?
man and who's
It's
the
like,
woman? Who's the femme
yeah,
and who's the butch? Yeah, exactly.
yeah. So it's an interesting theory, structural dissociation. This part of it, how we develop. That's the part of the theory that I like. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
and
a,
then it kind of falls down after that. When it gets to the
right.
EPs and the ANPs and stuff, that's
Mm,
where it's really a educational theory to use in the classroom to help singular people understand plural people, and in that way, it's not so bad. But uh, once it's taken to the therapy room, and then the therapist is trying to apply it to an actual plural, or when we within the community try to apply it to each other or ourselves, that's where it starts getting shaky and falling down. There's no clear cut black and white between EP and ANP. And in the theory, it's very black and white. You know, you're this or you're that. You fall in one bucket or the other. And reality
yes.
isn't all black and white like that.
No, especially not if we get life experiences outside of that trauma. Like that trauma stopped, hopefully, for us it did. So after that, we gained other experiences in life that formed our personalities. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So some of us argue with the theory overall, but that little bit where it's about the early childhood development is at least comforting in that it's a theory where singular people are actually entertaining the idea of being plural from birth.
Yes. Yes. I don't know if they realize it, but yeah.
Yeah, that's basically what they're saying, It's like before being born, people are all quote unquote female, and then there's a hormone change
Yes.
that changes the secondary sexual characteristics of the zygote, baby, infant, fetus, whatever it is.
Right.
So that stuff changes after a certain point when certain hormones kick in, and then there's structural changes that happen. So it's kind of like that. We're all plural, and then structural changes happen that make singulars.
Poor singular people.
I know, right? I don't know who's better off. That's a good question,
right? So you want to talk a little bit about non-human alters?
Yeah.
Okay, so not all alters are human. In some systems they are, but not in all systems. Non-human alters are very common for plural systems overall. We did a poll in our support group alternation, and 85% of the nearly 300 people who participated said they have a non-human alter in their system. So that can be anything from an animal to a robot to an angel to a demon or anything in between or outside of those human boxes.
Yeah. So yeah, some people have robots or cyborgs and things like that too. Yeah. So there's like a wide range of I guess how we feel and how we express ourselves internally, or what we are. And yeah, so there's a lot of differences in multiples and who's in their head,
Yeah.
if you will.
Yeah. And many of those non-human alters were subconsciously developed in our child's brain and mind. And so it makes sense to me that that is what happened.
Yeah, what is big enough and strong enough to protect me from this stuff that's happening?
Right.
And whether it's an abuser or whether it's just trauma, like getting that extra comfort that something is so different than the problem, sometimes is where it can come from. Or we'll talk more in this video about other ways we may be inspired to have non-human alters. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in addition to those sensory states in the that's the developmental theory, back to the developmental theory, in addition to the sensory states or the parallel development of alters from birth, we also sometimes take on introjects. So there's many in our head to begin with sometimes, but then we're inspired by external sources. So rather than them being born in the body, sometimes we import or bring in the idea of different types of people or alters into our system. Um, yeah, so we're going to talk some about introjects.
Right. Introjects. Yes. Well, we have a few from all sides of life. So we have introjects who have always helped us. Everyone, of course, came to help, but those are like the helpers, the caretakers, and they are based on teachers, for example, from when we grew up. But we also have introjects who are based on not such nice people, which can go very, very deep, like abusers, but also like a therapist I once had that was really nasty. And I'm like, that's not like,
What are you
that
doing
was
in
not
here?
supposed to happen. Right? We are fully fragmented, so I guess it's not that hard for us to end up with a new interject or a new alter. But that surprised me when that happened.
Yeah, sometimes we will pull in quote unquote abusers or perpetrators because they're strong, because they're powerful. And another way we pull them in is because we think that if we're more like them, that they won't hurt us because it would be like them hurting themselves. So sometimes we mimic or copy them, and we make an internal alter that's similar. I mean, this is all subconscious, but sometimes it happens because we want to kind of fly under the radar and not be noticed, or escape punishment. And sometimes we can even see that in how siblings who don't get abused are sometimes the ones who are more like the abuser. So sometimes we might see somebody actually flying under the radar, and then we want to adopt that trait, so that maybe we'll escape negative attention and harm and stuff. So sometimes we take on external people for various reasons. But it's not always people that we take into our system. It's not always inspired by actual real people like teachers and therapists and so on. Sometimes we'll take in comforters, or we'll take in defenders and such from fictional work. So we take in characters and we call them fictives.
Yes, we do.
We do.
Not everyone, but some people do. Yes.
Yeah. So sometimes those are non-human. It all depends on like the source of the inspiration. So, what's a common interject? I'm trying to think of like let's say Pikachu or something.
Not sure if Pikachu is very popular or common.
I don't know. I'm not sure,
common.
but it could be.
Could be.
So yeah, so like somebody might take Pikachu into their system, just as a matter of course, subconsciously, because Pikachu can like shoot lightning bolts and stuff and is really powerful.
Right. Yes. It could happen.
It could happen. Like when you were talking about the teacher, we would call that a factive. It's based on a real life person, but they could also be a historical figure, somebody who inspired you for whatever reason. You're reading an autobiography and all of a sudden you find out they're in your head, and things like that. It doesn't happen because we want it to happen. It happens because it happens.
Yes.
There's no.
It's why I don't read autobiographies from plurals, because like from a single person, then I end up with one. But if I read
my goodness.
Right? So I'm careful with those books. I am.
Well, the same thing happened with fiction books too. So yeah, it's like people who end up with like Harry Potter people in their head and things like that. So it does happen to people in the and so people who watch a lot of anime may end up with anime characters in their system and so on. So so there's fictives, which are the fictional character imports, and then there's factives, which are the supposedly so-called real world or external reality people who are brought into the system.
And both are just as valid, just as real. There's no difference in how much say they should have or how real they are.
Right. That's why I say external world in quotes, like the real world in quotes, because our internal world is extremely real. And so, we're not trying to judge the internal world as not being real by saying the external world is quote unquote real. We don't believe in that. We think actually the external world is as made up as the internal world.
It might very well be.
That's like a new agey thing, but
yes, it is.
It's consensual reality is what we like to call it. So everybody agrees on the external world. So everybody inside agrees on the internal world,
Yes.
So that brings us to different origin beliefs. So our system doesn't always only take the psychology point of view on things. Psychology's only been around maybe 200 years. It was like developing 200 years ago. And it's not the only way to explain plurality, because plurality has been around probably as long as humans. So many cultures and belief systems have different thoughts on plurality over the last several thousand years. And some of it is actually documented. It's kind of hard to dig around and find it, but we've traced DID or something similar to DID back 500 plus years, like to the 1500s. So I guess 600 years. So in the 1500s, there's a documented case, I think in a church document, about somebody who is experiencing all the same symptoms that would fit the DSM criteria. That's why we say DID for that person. But plurality has probably been around as long as people have been talking to each other, or maybe before that too, who knows. So when we experience what we call introjects, we experience it in our internal culture or internal story in a very spiritual way. And they all have backstories, and they existed before they came into our body. So we call them, with the New Age term, walk-ins, because they came from outside, as far as we can tell. They came from outside. They came with their stories and stuff. So we only have like one factive who came from this lifetime childhood. So there are a lot of other lenses that humans in the world have used to explain plural experiences.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's been around for a long time, like you said. So it's too bad actually that we can't find more information from back in the day, that not more is documented. And I think that is because that stigma has always been there
Yeah.
for, like, in our Western society and culture of the modern age and time. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I agree. Yeah, there's definitely different ways of looking at it, let's say in Asia, or and we'll be hopefully having somebody who can address more of that, of the Asian culture, when we have the conference. But there's not as much written for the deep Africa stuff because they weren't writing things as much. And then we have a lot of written stuff from Western culture for the last 2 to 3 thousand years, maybe 4. But the Eastern culture has like 5 to 10,000 years. So, that's a lot. And I would love to dig into what they have in India or in China on things like this, because they go back really far, which would be really cool.
Right? Yeah, it would be really cool. I think a problem that we face with this is that the people who translate those text,
Yes.
they are singular. So they
Yeah,
translate it from a singular point of view, and that might mean that that things get lost in translation.
exactly. Yeah, definitely. Or omitted, or, not given the weight and relevance. It's
Mm,
like, we're not going to bother translating this document because it's obviously off the beaten path. It's weird. It's talking about things that we don't consider to have consequence. So we're not gonna bother translating it.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, there's probably a good bit of that, especially like medical texts and stuff
Mm,
from, because the Western medical tradition is really broken, and has there's been a lot of like burning of the Library of Alexandria, for example. There's been a lot lost in Western
right.
civilization as far as real documentation and medical wisdom, the
Yeah.
Inquisition, so on. When we get to Asia, their their medical system is much more intact and
Mm.
goes back much further. So it'd be really great to be able to get that. But we have to deal with the bias from the translations and so on. That's a great point. Other cultures around the world talk about plurality in terms of things like possession, for example. So plurals may exist in their culture, but they're framed differently than they are here in the U.S. and in the West, and Western Europe and so on. So we can we can see similarities between possession and plurality if we poke around and look at things. Um,
Yes, I think especially with possession that is seeked out by someone with consent who wants that spiritual experience. So in our Western culture, a lot of possession key is often people who don't want to be possessed. So they try to find deliverance from that. But there are also spiritual paths and cultures and people where they seek out that possession on purpose. And then we are getting into tulpomancy, I think.
or something. We're
Right?
getting certainly closer to tulpomancy if somebody is seeking it out. Yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, so it's definitely a big difference when it's not seen as a bad thing. When it's
Mm,
seen as something normal within a culture, when it's seen as something that maybe even imparts wisdom or is sought out by spiritual leaders, um, then we get into areas where where Western thought doesn't follow it and doesn't understand it, and often can't even like mentally deal with it. When you look at it through a psychology lens, you're looking at it through a very medicalized, disorder-based lens, and there's no room until you get to transpersonal and humanistic psychology. There's no room for the positive experience. There's no room
Right.
for it being a good thing or it being preferable for some reason. Whether people are reaching their own inner deep wisdom, and bringing it out, or whether they are pulling spirits from outside into their body and getting spiritual wisdom from external sources, you know, either way, there's
Yeah.
that extra wisdom that comes into the culture that's desirable. Um,
Mm.
yeah, so there's a lot of confusion in Western society over how to even think about that, and how to
Right.
frame it in a way that
Yeah.
they can even understand the cultures that desire it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like a barrier, between
Right.
different cultures. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting how the DSM writes about it, I think. You want
Yeah.
to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, they dance around the possession issue. So we have like a couple of quotes from the DSM on the possession form of DID, quote unquote. Yeah. Um, Possession form identities in dissociative identity disorder typically manifest as behaviors that appear as if a spirit, supernatural being, or outside person has taken control, such that the individual begins speaking or acting in a distinctly different manner. For example, an individual's behavior may give the appearance that her identity has been replaced by the ghost of a girl who committed suicide in the same community years before, speaking and acting as though she were still alive. Or an individual may be taken over by a demon or deity, resulting in profound impairment and demanding that the individual or a relative be punished for a past act, followed by more subtle periods of identity alteration. However, the majority of possession states around the world are normal, usually part of a spiritual practice, and do not meet criteria for dissociative identity disorder. The identities that arise during possession-form dissociative identity disorder present recurrently, are unwanted and involuntary, cause clinically significant distress or impairment, criterion C, and are not a normal part of a broadly accepted cultural or religious practice, criterion D. Firstly, I really love the reference to affective in there, where
Right?
where the actual person was brought into somebody's system. Um, and so that is kind of interesting. And then, sorry about the religious words. And then the other thing we think about, like, they don't really want to talk about spirits and possession and so on as if it's a real, actual thing. They're kind of
Mm.
dancing around it, trying to frame this whole thing in psychology speak, and 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 kind of like whitewashing it, if you will. They're like painting it over with white Western culture, and ignoring that these other cultures have been around a lot longer than psychology. Like a lot longer than
Yes.
psychology. Psychology is only 200 years old, let's say. So it's like, yeah, these guys trump you, and maybe they actually know what they're talking about. So it's very, um, I don't know, it's clinical and cold.
Mm. Yeah. It's trying to stay neutral, but it's so not neutral.
Yeah, exactly. They
So,
broadly accepted. Yeah,
yeah. So if it's not possession and it's not the ID, then what is it?
right, exactly. It's something they don't want to talk about.
Mm. Yeah. Another thing that we should address in this video, in my opinion, is the Western white culture view. The DSM is written by a bunch of generally white older men in a room trying not to offend anyone directly, but talking about things they know nothing about.
Yep. So another quote from the DSM where they try to take that clinical perspective, because they're clearly in territory where they can't negotiate, on psychology terms, lest they be an equal opportunity offender. They offend everybody. Cultural appropriation, and so on. So it's labeled culture-related diagnostic issues. Many features of dissociative identity disorder can be influenced by the individual's cultural background. Individuals with this disorder may present with prominent medically unexplained neurological symptoms, such as non-epileptic seizures, paralyses, or sensory loss in cultural settings where such symptoms are common. Similarly, in settings where normative possession is common, e.g., rural areas in the developing world among certain religious groups in the United States and Europe, the fragmented identities may take the form of possessing spirits, deities, demons, animals, or mythical figures. Acculturation or prolonged intercultural contact may shape the characteristics of the other identities. E.g., identities in India may speak English exclusively and wear Western clothes. Possession form dissociative identity disorder can be distinguished from culturally accepted possession states in that the former is involuntary, distressing, uncontrollable, and often recurrent or persistent, involves conflict between the individual and his or her surrounding family, social, or work milieu, and is manifested at times and in places that violate the norms of the culture or religion. That's a lot of words.
It's a lot of words.
But it's a lot of words saying, we're not so sure about, when DID presents itself in other cultures. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And they're they don't know what to do with it in some ways. They're not sure where the line is between when it's okay and when it's not okay. They're trying to make it when it's distressing and so on. But if I'm presenting, let's say, as some protector, some angry mythical figure or whatever, and I'm attacking our family, is that because the family actually did me harm? It's like, maybe there should be conflict. Maybe maybe that would be like completely normal for me to have conflict with my family. So why would that automatically make this a problem? But the involuntary, distressing, uncontrollable part, that I agree with.
Yeah, I guess so. But
if it's distress, and maybe you need help. That's basically
right.
Yeah.
After you read this text, you said it's a lot of words, but actually it's not. I mean, they're trying to summarize the whole world, every culture in like one paragraph.
True.
It's not very realistic, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. So some of these cultural related diagnostic issues, some of these diagnostic criteria that the exclusions in criteria D and E. So some of these cultural exclusions could be people who would self-identify as plural. So, for example, we are a shamanic practitioner, and in practicing shamanism, we often ask ourselves, are our spirit helpers, are the companion spirits that help us out, are they inside or outside of our head? We don't know whether they're just, quote unquote, just alters, or are they actually spirits that are outside of us. So if we switch between the lenses, the shamanic lens says they're helpers and they're outside. And then we switch to the psychology lens. Well, maybe they're not outside. Maybe we're just projecting them outside. We just think they're outside. They sound like they're outside. They feel like they're outside. But maybe they're just alters. So when we flip lenses, our head count goes up. So people can project their alters outside of their body, so it's really hard to say.
It is, yes. I think it's also important to look at what the person is feeling, is saying, is wants, right? And that's what I like about the plural label. You can self-identify. If you want to be plural, you can be plural, basically, right?
Yeah.
And with the diagnostic criteria, obviously that's not the case, but we see so many people who are even DID people who do not fit the DID label,
Yeah.
right? And that's sad and offensive and not right, because
No.
those people, if they say they are a traumagenic system, to call it that, and they want that DID label, they should be able to get it, but some of them can't.
Right. For many reasons.
Yeah. There's no need to pursue a diagnosis if you're not disordered, or if you do not experience your plurality as a disorder, of course.
Yeah.
But if you want to bring it up in therapy, just like I have therapy for depression or anxiety, and I bring it up there, it's going to be seen as a problem.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
going to be seen as a disordered thing.
Exactly.
Even
Yeah.
though for me it's not for me, it is, but for in another life, it's not. And
The
then
theoretical person in the office, it's not a
right,
problem. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And some of the things we're talking about here are some of the fringe experiences that some people, even under the plural umbrella, sometimes question. Like, why would
Mm.
shamans, why would shamanic practitioners or shamans be potentially considered plural? So they may be singular in their body, and then their spirit helpers are definitely outside, and they have no personal need to identify as plural. Whereas others may question it, like I do, but maybe
Right,
they are quote unquote singular, but they're not sure whether the
right.
spirits that they're speaking with are inside or out. And maybe they're like, I want to explore this plural thing, or I want to identify as plural. These people understand my experiences. When we talk about it, it makes sense.
Mm.
So maybe they want the plural label. So we put them under the umbrella as a Venn diagram type of thing. It's like some shamanic practitioners may identify as plural. So the same thing goes for some other groups as well. Voice hearers being one of them.
Yes, as much as 28% of the general population reports having heard voices. So some voice hearers may choose to identify as plural as well. It's not rare at all.
Right? Exactly. And then there's other cultures and practitioners of other spiritual practices that actually, like we were talking earlier, they seek out ritual possession states, or they seek out things that might be considered overlapping, channeling, for example, channeling spirits or speaking with spirits and so on. So we don't know whether the voices they're hearing or the wisdom they're seeking is really external, or it's
Mm.
something internal to them. So is a channeler really an intuitive healer, and they're hearing it as a voice, or it's somebody else in their system who's bringing them the wisdom, and so on. So we don't know. We're letting other people define whether they belong under the plural umbrella, and we're saying we will accept anything. Basically, we're inclusive. So these are some of the examples of us being inclusive of other experiences and really curious about them, because there's so much we could learn
Yes.
from them. Um, and there's some mainstream religious practices around the world, various religions, Western, Eastern, where they may be channeling aspects of a deity or their deity's helpers, their God squad, if you will. They may be channeling their deity's helpers. I'm not going to use the specific names for them, but they may be channeling their deity's helpers to for whatever reasons, that are
Mm.
underneath their religion.
Yes.
Gotta love when somebody like inserts something. Oh, thank you guys. um, so hopefully we covered plenty of ground in this little educational episode. And we're going to stop recording now because we are gone on
Yes.
long enough. Um,
Yes. It's way longer than initiated, but I think it's a good video. So we hope this was informative to you, that you learned something new, and that you feel included within the community.
yes, and we'll see you in the next video. Some portion of us, plural
Yes.
against folk, will see you in the next video. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Have a good Plurals Acceptance Week.
um, yeah, do we want to read the other one or? Or what?
Good. Did we say the DSM is written by a bunch of generally white old men in a room trying not to offend anyone directly, but talking about things they know nothing about?
No, we didn't say that, but we just did.
No, I will redo it. I will redo it. I will look them in the face. Okay, we will put this at the bloopers. So, another thing that should be mentioned in this video, in my opinion, is that Western wild culture view. Western white culture view. Wow, that's not easy to pronounce. Okay,